So, Nick, you had an epiphany about artificial intelligence.
Yes, and this epiphany came while I was showering and listening to a book on tape about artificial intelligence, as probably makes sense to those who've had shower epiphanies in their own lives. Um, I was listening to this book, which is about the potential future and rise and development of the AI wave, as the author calls it. And I was thinking, well, the thing is, AI, I mean, I was saying it needs to play a role in the Spacers Saga is like saying that we need fish at the fish market. It's an obvious statement, and it's a statement that doesn't need to be said. But the way we do depict AI in the Spacers Saga, that's what's important. It's not necessarily that there needs to be fish at the fish market. It's what kind of fish are you going to sell and how much you're going to sell it for. Um, so the epiphanies that I had, kind of a dual epiphany that kind of feeds into itself, is that the Zarans, which we have established are not technically AI, they're not technically robots because they're closer to clones and replicants than they are to robots because they're basically like biogenetically engineered beings that were grown in vats. We've got to establish right that we've established that right in the canon of the Spacers the Erebus effect. It's right in the text. But I've had this sort of idea bouncing around in my head for a while now that I think finally took form, which centers on the idea that what makes the Zarans different, what makes them unique and not just clones of humans or like biogenetically engineered replicants of humans, is that they have linked minds. Is that they're humans plus. The thing that separates Homo zarensis or whatever you would call it from Homo sapiens is that the Zaran being has a mind that is linked to the neural network um insert my name here. I haven't really named it yet. I've had a couple of names that I've toyed with.
We can just call it the neural network.
Yeah, I just call it. I usually just refer to it as the network.
Okay.
Keep it simple.
So, this idea of the Zarns all communicating within a neural network is that established in Spacers the Erebus Effect, which is our new novel that is out this year.
Not necessarily, and the reason I say that is because Zarans. That's part of why they want freedom
Yeah.
because they want to be able to pursue this part of themselves. It's something they kind of established more so after their revolution, after the Zaran uprising, which happens obviously after the events of Spacers the Erebus effect. Is they had a revolution not only in terms of like political uprising, but in terms of how they organized their society. It's kind of as if someone were to. It's kind of as if the Zarans led a revolution, rose up against human society, and then created the Borg Collective. I mean, for Christ's sake, I call the Zarin society in the Spacer Saga the Zarin Collective. You know, it's on the nose, but it has to be because that's what it is. That's what it's meant to be.
Because I know in Spacers the Erebus Effect, our novel that's out this year, um, there are, without giving too much away, without giving any spoilers, there are scenes where characters don't seem to have their own free will, where
Mm-hmm.
they have kind of a reduced free will.
Mm-hmm.
There are some that, uh, you know, seem to be have an independent agency. Now, is it all Zarns are connected like this, or is it just they all have the capability of it, and it's only used against them by like the military, by like a pimp, by like sex slaves, stuff like that?
So basically, when the Zarans form their own society eventually, they realize this potential of themselves to have linked minds. And when I say linked minds, I don't necessarily mean like, oh, one Zarn is forcing another Zarn to do something where they're like worker bees. It's more like it's kind of like a social network, but more intense. It's kind of like it's kind of like telepathy, but across an entire race.
Okay.
It's something along. It's more akin to those sorts of to those. To, it's more analogous to those sorts of things than it is to say um, like mental thought control or something.
It's not the Borg.
it's not literally the Borg, but it's Borg-esque. It's more like the one Zarn sees, like, because again, you think of the applications. Say it's for security, for example. Say one Zarn sees something shady going on in a city, they can report it to the other 1,000 Zarns in that part of the city and say, "Hey, watch out! There's something going on here." You
Yeah.
know. So it's more like, and that's kind of what it started as. It started as like a way to share information. And again, the reason it would probably have started within the context of the lore is because, let's be frank, what were the Zarns created for? They were created to be a source of cheap, disposable labor for like off-world infrastructure building. So having them able to communicate with each other near instantaneously without vocalization, without the need for faulty, fallible radio communication and hand signals, anything like that, is very beneficial. But it also has downsides, which is why humans eventually start to control it and use it against them.
So, for example,
Mm-hmm.
and I know this is a 30,000-foot shower epiphany that you had, so you haven't thought through all the details, but you got me to poke holes and, tear your ideas down to make it better. Why doesn't the woman who works in the diner that Janet sees have telepathy?
That would most likely be because at that point the Zarns were having their telepathy controlled by the humans.
Okay.
Because again, one of the biggest reasons why the Zarns are organizing for possible revolution around the time of Spacers the Erebus effect is because they see that it's again, I think I've used this analogy with you, and you seem to respond to it well for obvious reasons. It's like these Cylons in the Battlestar Galactica reboot. They, who believe that they can never attain their full potential so long as humans exist, because they'll always live in the shadow of humans. Zarns are kind of similar. I mean, I may be misremembering that quote or wherever I read at some point,
It's
10
similar.
years ago. It's similar. Yeah, I thought it was
Yeah.
similar. But it's sort of along the same line. It's not just that the Zarns can't have their own culture so long as humans exist, because they'll always be basing their culture off that of their creators. It's that they can't have their own free will, because the humans are basically have, if the Zarn network, the uplink, whatever you want to call it, is like a faucet that's flowing. The hand of human society is basically turn that faucet so that it's only dripping,
So
and
two
they want to open it up again.
so either it's a real deep secret. It would have to be, because the space cops who hunt the robots don't know about it, because she would have talked about it.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying we can't do that. You know why it's not a plot hole? Because they don't need to have telepathy for Erebus to work. Erebus works without telepathy. The Zarns work without having this mental thing you've been talking about. I know you said you've been bouncing this, right? You've been bouncing this idea around in your head for years, and that's cool. And that just means we introduce it differently. Is that we introduce it as a new thing post Erebus.
Mm-hmm. In the chronology.
Yeah, it's not a thing they've always had.
Yeah.
Because then that's like saying, oh, Superman always had, like, a little sister named Jamie the whole time.
I don't think this is in Erebus, but there's an element of another book called Project Cormorant. Cormorant, like the bird. And what Project Cormorant is basically me not shoehorning, because it's part of the lore from the beginning, but it's me sort of putting a leaf in the book to say this is how Project Erebus got started. And maybe part of Project Erebus was linking the Zarn minds so they could link up. Was setting the groundwork in motion so that the Zarn infiltrators could communicate telepathically, or quasi telepathically. So we sort of it's not really a retcon, but it's sort of retroactively explaining this is how the Zarns are able to do this thing they started doing in Erebus Book 2, using this bit from another book we might not even publish for a while.
So the newest batch of the robots can speak to each other telepathically. It can be just that simple.
Yeah.
And they're building new robots and stuff. All the new robots are telepathic soldiers or whatever.
Yeah.
And that explains why the old ones, when Janet's chasing robots through a whorehouse and shooting them, that's why they weren't like telepathically talking to each other.
Yeah.
Because if I'm your reader and I say, oh, you look back through the first book, none of that shit makes sense. If it's inconsistent, we're sunk.
Yeah.
So
That's something the other publisher that I worked with for that short story years ago told me, is that readers will find inconsistencies and they will kick you to death before them.
yeah, that's how it makes sense.
Yeah.
That's how we make it make sense. Is we do it that way.
Because if you know why that's cool?
Why?
Is it called because it's kind of an homage to Blade Runner. Is you remember how in Blade Runner 2049 it's basically revealed that the whole secret of how Rachel was the replicant who could give birth was basically an experiment that Eldon Terrell did just to say fuck you to everybody who else was trying to do it, and then it never happened again.
Is that what happened?
Yeah, that's pretty much. Have you seen Blade Runner 2049?
Yeah, in theaters. And like, I'll be honest, man, I kind of zoned out the last 40 minutes because, like, I just remember Harrison Ford fighting a guy in a flying car that's sinking into the ocean.
Yeah.
And I'm watching this, and I'm like, you could have cut out like 30 minutes of this movie. Like, this movie should have been over by now.
Well, that's basically the central conceit, is that there's a replicant that Rachel gave birth, and the what was it? That's basically what happened, is that she because it kind of harkens back to that line that Terrell says in the first Blade Runner, that Rachel, where he says Rachel was an experiment. They were experimenting and they did something, and they basically said, that's cool. But to them, to those who play God, doing something amazing is just Tuesday,
Yeah.
So
Sorry if I, harshed your epiphany. It's
no, you're
more,
fine.
it's
Because I still got another epiphany for you. We can harsh that one too.
well, it's not harshing, man. It's more, you had a really cool idea, and I'm like, hey, here's where it doesn't fit into the book that's coming out.
Yeah.
And so that just means I'm here to help fucking make it work.
Doesn't fit into the book that we've spent the last year getting ready.
Basically.
If I'd had this idea a year ago, we could have fit it into the book, but I did not, so we can't.
I mean, I probably would have told you we don't need it because it doesn't serve the story, because it doesn't serve that story. Right? When I say things like this character doesn't matter or this doesn't serve the story, I think you hear this doesn't matter, like this doesn't serve the Spacers Saga writ large. What I mean is this doesn't serve this one particular like 60-page novel we wrote, or 60,000 words. Like, you're seeing the whole thing from like this big overview. And when when I say things like it doesn't serve the story, I mean it doesn't serve this little episode we're working on.
Mm-hmm.
It's a cool idea. It just, things have to kind of like fit.
Yep.
Anyway, you had another epiphany I can ruin. Go.
No, you're the other epiphany is something that I've kind of been bouncing back and forth, like bouncing off the wall in my head for years now, which is that, and this is, again, we don't necessarily even need to be recording for this one, because this is stuff that's not even going to be part of the legendarium or whatever for years probably.
Go on.
But the idea that the AI that is like the god of humanity, not literally God, but like basically the equivalent of God, is essentially, I'm trying to figure out how to vocalize this in a way that makes sense to someone who hasn't spent the last 20 years, picking apart this world building this world every day.
Okay.
Because basically what it is, do you remember that conversation we had a while ago about the precursors and the
Yes.
Adraeans and all that stuff? There's
Yes.
the beings that lived before humans, but they also lived after humans, and it's kind of amorphous as to where they actually fall in the timeline, whether they came before us or they are like an evolution of us, or maybe it's both. You don't have to say yes; it's fine if you don't remember.
I remember the precursors. I don't remember that second part.
Well, that's kind of where it was going, is that the Adraeans are like the beings that Anubis is one of in the Journeyman series,
Okay.
Journeyman books, is is an Adraean, and they're basically they're one of the precursor races, meaning that they were probably around before humans, but they're also somehow like way a way of it's kind of like one of
Like
those
they're
beings.
immortal.
They're immortal, but it's not just that they're immortal. It's that they basically evolved to a point where they're not stuck into a particular point in the timeline.
They're cute.
Basically, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's they're and it's kind of insinuated they're basically like a far future example of humanity. That's part of why, again, Q. But that's kind of why one of the reasons why they care about Earth, because it's like, oh, this is where we come from. We're basically going back and like eating popcorn while we watch our great times a billion grandparents, schmucking around. Um,
Immortal godlike beings that were probably the descendants of the Zarns.
exactly. That's the thing. Is again, it goes back to what we said about how the Zarn. This is a story almost as much about how the Zarns are evolving beyond humanity as it is a story about humanity itself.
They go back in time and they're not what you call like they're not genteel caretakers of the timeline so much as, hey, let's see what we can fuck around with.
Well, some of them are. That's
Okay.
the thing. Some of them are capricious. Some of them are genteel. Some of them are somewhere in between. They're beings. They're not a monolith.
Okay.
They're not monolithic, I guess I should say. But that's kind of what it is. And that would kind of explain why they seem to be both in the ancient past and also in the far future. Because if they're simulating this universe, then of course they would be at multiple times because they're coming not from within the universe but from without it. If that makes any sense. So like you have a character who's effectively immortal, but it's because they're not from within this universe. They're basically it's like
You
imagine if
know, you know what we do
what?
when we do this story? We use Cameron Powell from Spacers Book One.
Mm-hmm.
We use that version of that character. We use the outlines we had for books 2 and 3, and then they say, "Oh, this is where you would have gone." And then he's basically talking to us. We do some real like up our own belly button writer shit
Which I
where
love.
I know, me too. And where you and I are precursors or Adreans or whatever you call them. And then
Well,
um
if I told you my idea for how to incorporate like the whole like immortal godlike being thing into the narration,
it gets even better, Nick.
I'll go ahead and I'll tell you mine.
When you and I pull him out of that universe, we tell him how that's a failed experiment. It's a failed universe, Nick. And so we rebooted the universe to one we liked even better. That's how we do it. And then he says, "What? My whole life is a lie?" And we're like, "Yeah, bud, you are an unprofitable universe." Because it gets even better. They're not simulated just for shits and giggles, they're simulated for likes and subscribes.
We might not go that far,
Just saying.
but that's an idea. It's because it's actually an idea that I've had in the
Mm-hmm.
past. It's the idea that they're basically simulating the universe over and over again to see which version works better.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's kind of like there's an idea I had that this all started because someone kind of like Vernon Morrow, maybe not exactly Vernon Morrow, but someone along the same lines as Vernon Morrow is like, I want to create a better universe than the one where 2 million people died in Phoenix.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's a reason why in the history timeline of the Frontier Wars that I've probably sent to you a half dozen times by now in
Sure.
various forms. It goes from 2013 to 2389. Because 2389 is the start date of the second Frontier Wars, which is the main story.
Mm-hmm.
The characters, Devin, Matt, and Sam take part in, and all their friends and antagonists and blah blah blah. And the reason it starts in 2013 is because when it's 2013 is when the Phoenix event happens, which is the major point of departure. You may have heard of that term or something similar, whatever it is, from alternate history. Like there's a point of departure from the real world. The point of departure in the Spacers Saga is this asteroid destroying Phoenix in March, or I think it's March or maybe June of 2013, and that's what incites everything that happens after it. And it's basically characters from the future, whether it's a couple decades in the future, maybe, or whatever, or a couple billion years in the future, trying to say, how can we redo this and make it better? And basically what they keep coming back to is they can't go before that and prevent that from happening, but they keep trying to change events after that to perfect them. And it's kind of why, like, the character of Anubis.
So why do you keep changing the Spacers Saga to perfect it, Nick?
Because I'm bored,
Yeah.
restless, need something to do.
Yeah.
So this is basically a way it's very meta. It's very very meta. It's author self insertion. And can I tell you my idea now that I was going to say a minute ago? The idea I had, and this is something that I had probably like 5 years ago, maybe even before we started really working together on Spacers or anything, is that the narrator, basically, there's like most of the Spacers Saga books. Obviously, some of them are first person, like
Mm-hmm.
past tense, like the detective stories, for example. But most of the Spacer Saga is narrated third person omniscient,
Mm-hmm.
as if it was someone watching from above.
Mm-hmm.
My idea is that at some point, the main characters of the Frontier Wars cycle basically make contact with the Adraeans, and the Adraean they make contact with, when they get there, the narration switches from third person to first person.
I love it. That's
And
fantastic.
it's like Devin, Matt, and Sam walked into the room and I saw them standing there.
I love it. That really works.
Yeah.
That's pretty brilliant. We'll get there.
Yeah. So I was
But
about to say we don't necessarily have to cover it now, but we could maybe cover that later.
but for the Blanket Fortress of Solitude, I am Derwin,
And I am Nick.
and we will see you next time.